The call came at 4 in the morning, and the first thing Holloway said to me wasn't hello. It was, "Don't ask who it's for." I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and my sewing kit already in my hand, because some part of me had been packing it before he finished the sentence. The kettle I put on out of habit was still cold. I hadn't turned the stove on yet. I just stood there in the dark with my coat half-buttoned, listening to a man breathe on the other end of the line like he was deciding how much silence he could afford before I hung up on him. "You still there?" he said. Not a question. Holloway never asked questions when a statement would do the same work. "I'm here." "Good. Bring the kit." The full one, not the travel roll. "And we're something you don't mind ruining." I didn't ask why. I had learned a long time ago that the strangest jobs paid the best, and I needed this one more than I needed sleep. My rent was 2 weeks from due, my father's shop lease was one missed payment from a lawyer's letter, and I had exactly enough fabric on hand to finish maybe 3 more commissions before I'd have to start turning people away. So I zipped my kit shut, grabbed my coat off the hook by the door, and let myself out into a street that still smelled like rain from the night before, even though it hadn't rained in a week. The drive across town took 11 minutes at that hour. No traffic, just the hum of streetlights clicking past, and the radio turned down so low it was barely more than a suggestion of music. I made this drive before, always at strange hours, always for reasons Holloway never explained beyond the bare minimum required to get me in the door. I told myself, the way I always did, that it was just tailoring. Suits for the dead. A niche market, morbid but honest work, and it paid better than anything I could get sewing hems for tourists downtown. The funeral home was lit like a hospital when I got there, every light on, every curtain drawn, and there were more cars in the back lot than I had ever seen for a private viewing. I counted them without meaning to, 11, parked at odd angles like they'd arrived in a hurry and hadn't cared about making it easy for anyone to leave. A man I didn't recognize checked my bag at the door like I was walking into a courthouse instead of a mortuary. He was young, maybe younger than me, with the kind of stillness that comes from being told exactly what to watch for and nothing else. He went through my kit piece by piece. Needles, thread, thimbles, the little brass shears my father had given me, and set each one back exactly where he'd found it, like precision mattered more than speed. "She's clean," he said to someone I couldn't see, and stepped aside. Holloway met me in the hallway, with his tie already crooked, which told me more than he wanted it to. In 4 years of working for him, I had never once seen Holloway's tie crooked. He was a man who ironed his shirts twice, who kept a spare comb in his breast pocket, who once sent a hearse driver home for having a scuff on his left shoe. A crooked tie on Holloway was the equivalent of another man screaming. "Thank you for coming," he said, which was also new. He didn't usually thank me. He paid me, and the payment was supposed to be thanks enough. "You said it was urgent." "It is." He glanced down the hall, toward a set of double doors with frosted glass, behind which I could make out shapes moving, unhurried, deliberate. He was respected. That was all he told me. Not loved, not missed, respected, like it was a job title, like the word itself was doing all the grieving anyone in that building intended to do. I followed him past the frosted doors, down a narrower hallway I hadn't been in before, to a back room where an older man lay dressed, but not finished, his jacket open, one cufflink missing, his hair combed in a way that made him look like he was only sleeping badly. I got to work the way I always did, hands first, questions later. The suit was good wool, expensive, tailored somewhere that knew what it was doing. I could tell by the way the shoulders sat, by the hand-stitched buttonholes, by 100 small choices that told me a real tailor had built this jacket for this exact man's body, not for a mannequin's approximation of him. I was only there to fix what travel and time had undone. A seam at the shoulder had split. The cufflink was gone. The collar had folded wrong on one side, the kind of small indignity that happens to a body once it stops correcting itself. That was when I felt him behind me before I heard him. A man in the doorway, still, watching the way you watch something you already understand completely. Not curious, not impatient, just watching, the way you'd watch rainfall if you already knew exactly how long the storm would last. He was tall, dressed in charcoal that fit him the way good tailoring fits a person who has never once in his life had to settle for off the rack. Every line of it deliberate, nothing borrowed, nothing accidental. He didn't introduce himself. He only said the tie was wrong, that it should sit higher, tighter, the way the dead man used to wear it himself. "You knew him," I said before I could stop myself. "I did. Then you'll know if I get it wrong." Something in his face moved, not quite a smile. "I'll know." I fixed it without arguing, because he was right, and because something in his voice told me arguing wasn't a real option in that room. I redid the knot twice before it sat the way he wanted, tighter than fashion would dictate, higher than comfort would allow, exactly the way a man who cared more about precision than ease would have worn it every day of his life. The man in the doorway watched my hands the entire time. While I worked the jacket lining, checking the inside seams for anything travel had loosened, I found a strange double row of stitching along one seam, thicker than it needed to be, sewn by a hand that wasn't mine and wasn't careless either. It ran along the inner breast panel, hidden by the lining, the kind of detail no one would ever see unless they were looking for it, or unless they were a tailor who couldn't help but notice when thread didn't belong. I assumed it was a manufacturing flaw, the kind of thing a rushed factory leaves behind, and I resealed it clean and moved on because that was my job, not my business. I had learned not to ask questions about the men I dressed for their last appearance. Questions had a way of making a good client into a nervous one, and nervous clients didn't call back. I didn't know yet that I had just finished something. I only knew the man in the doorway watched my hands the entire time, like he was memorizing them, like the shape of my fingers doing ordinary work meant something to him that I couldn't see from the inside of it. If you've ever had someone study you like they were trying to learn you by heart instead of just looking at you, tell me you understand, because I had no idea yet what I just walked into. I finished an hour before dawn, when the room had gone that particular gray that isn't quite morning and isn't quite night either. I packed my kit the way I always did, methodically, needles first, and when I turned around, the man in the doorway was gone, as if he'd never been there at all, except that the crooked tie was still tied the way he'd told me to tie it, still exactly right. I left with an envelope of cash I didn't count until I was in my car, and it was more than the job should have paid, nearly triple my usual rate for what amounted to 40 minutes of actual work. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, counting it twice because I didn't believe it the first time and told myself it was generosity or guilt or the strange economics of grief. Holloway walked me to the door himself, which he never did, and he said the same line twice like he needed me to actually hear it. "You didn't see a name tonight. You didn't see a face. That's how you keep this job." "I understand," I told him, and I meant it right up until I glanced back through the glass door and saw the man from the doorway standing at the end of the hallway, still watching me go like leaving didn't end anything for him at all. He didn't wave. He didn't nod. He just watched with the patience of a man who had already decided he'd be seeing me again and felt no need to rush toward it. 2. I told myself it was nothing on the drive home. The sky had gone the color of old bruises by the time I got back to my apartment, and I had a business to save and no room left in my head for a stranger's eyes. I made coffee I didn't drink and sat at my kitchen table with the envelope of cash in front of me, and I let myself, for exactly 3 minutes, imagine a version of my life where money like that came easily and often. Then I put the cash in a coffee tin where I kept what little savings I had left and got ready for a day of ordinary work. Hems, a wedding alteration, a jacket that needed its lining replaced for a client who complained about everything and tipped for nothing. The letter had come 3 days earlier, sitting unopened on my counter because some part of me already knew what it said before I read it. I'd propped it against the sugar bowl, like it was a bill I could ignore by pretending it was decorative. It was from a law firm representing Desmond Argyle, my father's old business partner, a man I'd met exactly twice in my life, both times at events where he'd shaken my hand a beat too long and told me how much I resemble my father, as if that were a compliment and not a comparison he intended to use against me later. The letter used words like exclusive rights and prior agreement, dense paragraphs stacked with legal scaffolding designed to make an ordinary person feel too small to argue. And underneath all of it, one plain fact rose to the surface like a stone through water. He believed the name on my shop window, my father's name, legally belonged to him now. Not the money, not the debt, the name itself. I hadn't touched the envelope again since that first night, because touching it made it real, and I needed one more week of it not being real before I had to fight for something I thought was already mine. I went to the shop instead, unlocked the front door under the sign that read Castellan Bespoke in gold letters my father had chosen himself, and spent the morning pretending the letter didn't exist by burying myself in work that used my hands enough to keep my mind from wandering back to it. A woman came in around 11 for her wedding alterations, and I pinned her hem twice before I got it right, and she told me, not unkindly, that I seemed distracted. I told her I hadn't slept well. It wasn't a lie exactly. It just wasn't the whole truth, and I was starting to understand that the whole truth was becoming a rarer thing in my life than it used to be. That afternoon, alone in the shop, I finally opened the envelope. I read it twice, then a third time, looking for a loophole my untrained I wouldn't have known to look for anyway. The gist of it was simple and devastating. My father and Desmond Argyle had signed a partnership agreement decades ago, back when the shop was young and the name Castellan was still finding its footing in a city that hadn't yet decided to care about it. The agreement, as Argyle's lawyers read it, gave him equal claim to the business name in perpetuity, regardless of who had built the shop's reputation, regardless of who had kept the lights on through 2 recessions and a fire that had gutted the back room in a year I still didn't like to think about. I called the number on the letter, more out of instinct than strategy, and got a receptionist who told me Mr. Argyle's firm didn't take calls from represented parties, and did I have counsel yet? And if not, she could recommend someone, which felt less like kindness and more like a trap dressed up as one. I did not, at that point, have counsel. 3. The lawsuit stopped being a rumor 2 weeks later, when a courier handed me a stack of papers thick enough to hold a door open. I signed for it standing in my own doorway, still in my work apron, a pincushion strapped to my wrist like a small, useless shield. Desmond Argyle wasn't just suing for money. He was suing to take the word Castellan off every sign, every label, every piece of paper my father had ever touched, based on an old partnership contract, so vague it might as well have been written in a different language. I sat down right there on the shop floor, papers spread around me like a storm that had already passed through and left its wreckage for me to sort. If he won, I wouldn't just lose income. I would lose the right to call anything mine by my father's name, which felt like losing him twice. Once to the heart attack that took him 3 years ago in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon fitting, and once now to a courtroom that would decide whether the name he'd built still belonged to the daughter who'd kept building it. I found a lawyer I could barely afford. A tired man named Greer with a small office above a dry cleaner's, stacks of files leaning against every wall like he'd given up trying to organize them and had instead decided to simply live among them. He read through the contract with the kind of patience that made me nervous rather than reassured. And when he finally looked up, he told me the case could take a year and empty whatever savings I had left before it was over. "Is there anything in here that helps me?" I asked. "There's language about original authorship," he said, tapping a clause halfway down the 3rd page. "If you can prove your father was the sole creative force behind the name and the brand, not just a co-signer on some old paperwork, it might undercut Argyle's claim. But proving intent from 30 years ago, with a man who could confirm it no longer alive to say so himself, that's not easy. That's not easy at all." I sat across from him and did the math in my head and came up short every single time. Retainer, hourly rate, the cost of expert witnesses if it came to that, all of it stacked against a shop that barely broke even most months and a coffee tin of cash that wouldn't stretch nearly as far as I needed it to. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed doing arithmetic that never came out any better no matter how many times I ran it. Retainer against rent, rent against the coffee tin against however many more quiet jobs Holloway might or might not call me for. At some point, I gave up on sleep entirely and went downstairs to the kitchen table, spreading the injunction papers out beside my father's old business cards, comparing his signature on one to the signature Argyle's lawyers had produced on the disputed contract, looking for some forgery I already suspected wasn't there. It wasn't there. My father really had signed that agreement decades ago in ink that had faded to the same brown as everything else that old, and whatever loophole existed, it wasn't going to be found by staring at a signature that was exactly what it claimed to be. I thought, not for the first time, about calling Argyle myself, lawyer be damned, and asking him plainly why a man who hadn't touched the business in a decade, wanted its name so badly now. I didn't call. Some instinct told me that whatever answer he gave me would be a performance, not a truth, and I didn't have the stomach that week for one more performance dressed up as an explanation. That same week, Holloway called again, another quiet job. No explanation, same generous pay that made no sense for the amount of work involved. I told myself I was taking it for the money, and that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth because some part of me wanted to see if he'd be there again. He was. 4. The second job was smaller in scope, but stranger in feeling. A different room this time, a different funeral home altogether. Holloway apparently had arrangements with more than one, which I filed away without asking about. And a different man in the casket, younger than the first, his jaw set in a way that made me think whatever had killed him hadn't given him time to prepare a peaceful expression for it. Holloway gave me the jacket already pressed, already nearly finished, and asked only that I check the lining and reinforce a seam near the collar that had come loose. He didn't speak to me this time. He stood farther back, near the far wall, watching the way a person watches something they've already decided about. I found it harder to ignore than the first night, when at least he'd spoken, when at least there had been the excuse of a crooked tie to explain why he was standing so close to me while I worked. Silence from him felt heavier than words. I kept glancing up between stitches, and every time, he was exactly where I'd last seen him, not shifting his weight, not checking his phone, not doing any of the small, restless things people do while they wait. Just watching. When I finished, I packed my kit slower than necessary, giving him room to speak if he wanted to. He didn't. He simply inclined his head, the smallest possible acknowledgement, and let me leave without a word. In the car afterward, I sat with the engine running and my hands on the wheel and asked myself honestly for the first time what exactly I thought I was doing. The money was good. The money was better than good. But I recognized, somewhere under the part of me that needed the cash more than it needed peace of mind, that I was starting to look forward to these calls in a way that had nothing to do with the envelope Holloway handed me at the door. I drove past my father's original shop on the way home. The real one, shuttered now, the windows dusty, the old sign still hanging crooked above the door because no one had ever taken it down. I stood outside it longer than I meant to, hands in my coat pockets, breath fogging in air that had turned cold sometime while I wasn't paying attention to the season changing. I wasn't sentimental by nature, but that sign was the last unedited version of him I had left, and Argyle wanted to erase it with a signature. I was still standing there when my phone buzzed with a process server confirming a delivery time for the next morning, and I already knew before I opened the door to my own shop the next day that it wouldn't be good news. It was an injunction, an attempt to freeze my signage while the case was pending, which meant I might have to cover my own father's name with paper while I fought to keep it. I stood on a ladder that afternoon with a roll of brown packing paper and a staple gun, taping over the gold letters one at a time, and I cried exactly once, briefly, angrily, before I finished the job and climbed back down. Ugh. The threat that came next wasn't aimed at me at all, which somehow made it worse to watch. A local paper, the kind that lived off gossip more than facts, ran a piece hinting that Holloway's funeral home did private business beyond funerals, the kind of phrase designed to make readers imagine exactly what they wanted without ever saying it outright. The article didn't name anyone. It didn't need to. It ran with a photo of the building at night, lit up the way it had been the first night I'd gone there, and a headline that asked more than it answered. I watched Holloway read it standing at his own front desk, and for the first time since I'd known him, his hands weren't steady. The paper trembled slightly as he turned the page, though whether from anger or fear, I couldn't tell, and maybe he couldn't either. He canceled 2 jobs that week without explanation, which cost me exactly the income I'd been counting on for legal fees. I'd already, foolishly, mentally spent that money on Greer's retainer before it ever arrived. "Holloway," I said, catching him in the hallway on my way out after the second cancellation. "What's actually going on here?" He looked at me like the question itself was dangerous, like I'd asked him to hand me something he wasn't allowed to touch either. "Nothing that concerns you." "It concerns me when it costs me money I was counting on." "Then find other work," he said, sharper than I'd ever heard him, and immediately looked like he regretted it. He softened just slightly. "I'll make it up to you. Just not now. Not this week." He changed the subject entirely after that, asking about a hem on a suit that didn't need discussing, and I let him because I recognized a closed door when I saw one, and I had learned by then that pushing on Holloway's closed doors only ever got me a smaller crack of light, never the whole room. That same week, for the first time, I got a call that had nothing to do with Holloway at all. A man introduced himself only as Adrian, said he needed a suit for an upcoming event, and asked for me specifically, by name, which no client had ever done before. I told myself it was ordinary work and drove to the address he gave me, telling myself the same thing the whole way. A townhouse on a street I didn't usually have reason to visit, the kind of block where the trees were older and better cared for than anything on my own street, where the cars parked along the curb cost more than my shop's annual rent. It wasn't ordinary. He opened the door himself, no staff, no formality, and for the first time I heard his full voice instead of few clipped words in a hallway. It was lower than I'd expected, warmer, with an unhurried quality that made everything he said sound like he'd already considered it carefully before letting it out. "You're the one Holloway won't stop talking about," he said, stepping back to let me in. I doubt that's true. It's true enough. He led me through a hallway lined with art I didn't recognize but suspected I should have, into a study with tall windows and a fire already going despite the mild weather outside. He says you don't ask questions. That's rare, in my experience. I ask plenty of questions, I said. I just don't expect answers, so I stopped wasting the breath. Something flickered across his face. Amusement, maybe, or the specific kind of interest a person shows when they've just been surprised in a way they weren't expecting to be. He was patient while I measured him, curious about my work in a way that felt genuine instead of polite, asking about the difference between a full canvas and a fused jacket, about how long it took to hand-finish a buttonhole, about whether I'd learned from a book or from a person. When I mentioned my father had taught me the trade, he asked real questions instead of nodding along. What my father had been like, whether I'd wanted to do this work or simply inherited the wanting along with the shop. Nothing about it felt dangerous. It felt, strangely, like being seen by someone who actually wanted to look. 6. Near the end of the fitting, as I marked his shoulders with tailor's chalk, careful and precise, he said, without any performance in his voice at all, that I was better at this than anyone he'd paid in years. It landed different than a compliment usually does. It landed like he'd actually been paying attention the whole time, not just to my hands, but to me, to the small furrow I got between my eyebrows when a seam wasn't sitting right, to the way I talked myself through a problem out loud without meaning to. "You say that to everyone who charges you money," I said, mostly to cover the fact that I didn't quite know what to do with the compliment. "I don't actually. Most people who charge me money are trying very hard to seem impressive. You're trying very hard not to ruin my collar." He looked at me then, steady, unhurried. "It's a better use of effort." I packed up my kit with more care than the job strictly required, stretching the visit a few minutes longer than necessary, and neither of us mentioned it. At the door, he thanked me by name, my actual name, not the tailor or Holloway's girl, which was how most of his world seemed to refer to me, and said he'd call again when the suit needed a second fitting, though we both understood, without saying so, that the second fitting was as much an excuse as the first appointment had been a genuine need. Share this with someone who's ever met a person too composed to trust and too honest to dismiss, because I was starting to believe he might be both at once. Driving home that night, I found myself thinking about him more than I wanted to admit, replaying small moments of the conversation the way you replay a song you can't quite get out of your head. It felt like a strange kind of relief after weeks of lawsuits and cancellations and a business partner's ghost haunting my mailbox. A few hours where I'd been allowed to simply be a good tailor talking to an interested client. Nothing more complicated than that. I told myself it would stay that simple. I was wrong, though it would take me weeks to understand exactly how wrong. 7. The investigator showed up on a Tuesday, and he didn't look like trouble at first, just a tired man in a cheap coat asking routine questions about my work for Holloway's funeral home. He introduced himself as Detective Marsh, showed a badge I didn't examine closely enough to remember the number on, and asked if he could come in and take a few minutes of my time. I let him in because refusing felt like it would draw more attention than answering, and because I genuinely believed at that point that I had nothing to hide. But routine questions have a way of turning into something else when the person asking already knows more than he's letting on. He asked about specific garments, specific dates, work I barely remembered doing, a navy suit from March, a charcoal one from June, details so precise he must have pulled them from somewhere official, receipts or records I hadn't known existed outside my own memory. And the more he asked, the more I understood he wasn't fishing. He already had a map. He just wanted to see if I'd draw the same lines he had. "Do you know a man named Reyes?" he asked, watching my face carefully as he said it. "No. You're sure?" "I'm sure. Should I know him?" He didn't answer that. He asked instead about the double stitching, describing in more detail than I'd ever shared with anyone, and I felt something cold move through my chest, because there was no way at all, he could know about that seam pattern unless someone had told him, or unless he'd examined the garments himself after they'd left my hands. "It's a manufacturer's flaw," I said, and heard how thin it sounded even as I said it. "I just repair what's in front of me." He nodded slowly, wrote something in a small notebook, and thanked me for my time in a tone that suggested he hadn't gotten what he came for, but hadn't expected to either. He left me his card and told me to call if I remembered anything else, and I stood in my doorway for a long time after his car pulled away, holding the card like it might tell me something more if I looked at it long enough. I went straight to Holloway afterward, driving faster than I should have, and found him in his office with the door half open. I told him about the visit, about the questions, about the way Marsh had said the words double stitching like he already knew exactly what they meant. For the first time, his evasiveness felt deliberate instead of private. He didn't lie to my face exactly. He just gave me nothing at all, which felt worse. A long silence, a careful rearranging of papers on his desk, a suggestion that I go home and rest, that this would sort itself out, that I shouldn't worry about things that weren't mine to worry about. "They're my hands doing the stitching." "Holloway," I said. "That makes it mine to worry about." He didn't have an answer for that. Or if he did, he wasn't willing to give it to me. I left his office angrier than I'd arrived, and I spent the drive home replaying every quiet job I'd ever done for him. Try to remember faces I'd been careful never to look at too closely, trying to remember whether any of them had felt wrong in a way I'd simply trained myself not to notice. I couldn't be sure. That was the worst part. 4 years of not asking questions had left me with almost nothing to reconstruct now that questions were the only thing that mattered. I called Marsh's number that night, the card still sitting on my kitchen counter where I'd left it, and hung up before it finished ringing. I told myself I wasn't ready. I told myself a dozen other things too, none of which were entirely true, and I went to bed with the card still on the counter, still unanswered, still waiting for a version of me brave enough or desperate enough to actually make the call. 8. Adrian showed up that same afternoon for a second fitting and found me still shaking from the morning, sitting on the stool behind my counter with a cup of tea gone cold beside me, untouched. He didn't ask about the investigator, though I found out later he already knew more than he let on. Later, I would understand that very little happened in this city that Adrian didn't hear about within hours, sometimes minutes. Instead, he sat with me at my own work table and asked to see my father's old partnership contract, the one Greer had already read twice and found nothing useful in. I hesitated. It felt strange, handing legal paperwork to a client I'd met exactly twice. But something about the steadiness of his attention made me want to hand it over anyway, made me believe, against my better instincts, that he might actually be able to help where a professional had already failed. He read it slowly, twice through, his finger tracing down each clause like he was hunting for something specific rather than simply skimming for the general shape of it. And then he found it, a small, oddly worded clause buried near the end of the second page. The kind of language that could have meant almost anything to an untrained eye, but that clearly meant something very specific to him. "Here," he said, tapping the paragraph. "This clause conditions Argyle's rights on continued material contribution to brand development. Has he contributed anything? Design input, marketing, capital investment, anything at all in the last, 10 years? Nothing. He hasn't set foot in the shop since before my father died. Then his claim isn't just weak. It's conditional, and the condition lapsed. Your lawyer should be arguing that this whole suit is built on a right he already forfeited by walking away from the business. Adrian sat back, and for a moment he looked almost pleased with himself, though not in a way that felt like showing off. I could be wrong. I'm not a lawyer, but I bet money I'm not wrong. Adrian found in 10 minutes what my lawyer had missed in 2 weeks, a clause that might actually undercut Argyle's entire claim. He didn't do it to impress me. He did it like it was simply what you did when someone you cared about was drowning in paperwork. Practical, unhurried, no fanfare attached to it at all. For the first time since this all started, I felt something close to steady. I called Greer that same evening, read him the clause over the phone, and listened to him go quiet in the particular way lawyers go quiet when they're recalculating everything they thought they knew about a case. That feeling lasted exactly as long as it took my phone to ring again the next morning. It was my lawyer, and his voice had none of its usual calm in it. The hearing had been moved up 3 weeks, and he told me to prepare like we were going to lose. If you've ever had one good hour followed immediately by the worst phone call of your month, stay with me, because the next part is where everything I thought I understood about Halloway started coming apart. 9. I went back through my recent work with a kind of attention I'd never given it before, pulling old order forms and receipts out of filing box I usually ignored, laying them across my kitchen table like a detective in a film I would have found ridiculous a month earlier. And there it was again, the same strange double-stitched panel, this time in a jacket for a different quiet job, sewn by the same unfamiliar hand as before. I compared the stitch length under a magnifying lamp I usually use for delicate embroidery work, counting stitches per inch, checking the tension of the thread, and it matched precisely down to the angle of the needle's entry point. It wasn't a flaw. Flaws don't repeat themselves that precisely. Someone was asking me, specifically, to sew these panels, and I didn't understand why or for whom. I thought back over every quiet job Halloway had sent my way in the last 2 years, trying to remember which jackets had carried that seam and which hadn't, and found I couldn't be certain. I never had reason to look before, never had reason to think it mattered. I confronted Halloway directly this time, no hedging, cornering him in his own office with the door shut behind me. What I got back wasn't a lie exactly. It was worse. He told me, gently like he was worried about me, that I was imagining a pattern that wasn't there, that the stress of the lawsuit was doing something to my perception, that grief and financial pressure could make anyone start seeing shapes in noise. He said it so calmly that for one terrible moment, I actually questioned myself. I went home that night and pulled out old receipts and sketches to prove to myself I wasn't losing my grip on reality, spreading them across my bed under lamplight, cross-referencing dates against my own memory of each job. And I found just enough uncertainty in my own records, a missing date here, an illegible note there, to stay unsettled instead of certain, which was somehow worse than either outcome would have been on its own. Certainty I could have acted on. This half-light of doubt just made me feel unmoored. That night, without telling anyone, I started a private notebook, a plain black one I bought from a drugstore on the corner, and began recording dates and details of every quiet job from that point forward. The address, the client's approximate age, any distinguishing detail about the garment, whether the strange seam appeared. I told myself it was nothing, just a habit to calm my own nerves, a way of proving to myself that I wasn't imagining things even if I never showed the proof to anyone else. It would turn out to be the most important thing I owned. Near the bottom of an old box in my father's storage unit, one I hadn't opened in over a year because opening it always cost me more than I expected it to, I found a photo I'd never seen before. My father standing beside a younger Halloway, both of them younger than I'd ever known either of them, and beside them a much younger man I didn't recognize at all, standing in front of a wall hanging with the exact same panel pattern I kept finding sewn into stranger jackets. I turned the photo over. On the back, in my father's handwriting, 3 initials and a date, nothing more. Has someone you trusted ever told you that you were imagining something you knew, somewhere in your gut, was completely real? Tell me below, because I was about to stop believing Halloway's version of anything. X. For one evening, none of it mattered. Not the lawsuit, not the stitching, not the investigator with his tired coat and his careful questions. Adrian invited me to dinner under the excuse of a final fitting, and we both knew it wasn't really about the suit. The suit had been finished for a week, hanging in a garment bag in my shop, waiting for an appointment neither of us had any real intention of rushing toward. He took me to a small restaurant, not the kind of place I expected from a man whose townhouse held art I didn't recognize but suspected I should have, a quiet, unpretentious room with candles that had clearly burned down and been replaced many times over, run by a family who greeted him by name and asked after people I didn't know. Cousins and uncles who apparently mattered to him in ways that had nothing to do with the world Holloway had pulled me into. We talked about my father, about the strange inheritance of a name you didn't choose but had to live inside anyway, about the particular grief of building something out of someone else's memory and never quite knowing if you were doing it justice. He talked carefully about inheriting a role he didn't choose either, though he never said exactly what that role was, and I didn't push. There was a kind of unspoken agreement between us that some doors would stay closed a while longer, and that this, for one night, was allowed. We talked about grief because it turned out we were both, in different ways, in the business of it. Him in ways I still didn't understand, me in every stitch I sewed for people who'd never wear the suit again themselves. I told him about my mother, who I barely remembered, gone before I was old enough to hold on to much of her, beyond a perfume I still couldn't identify whenever I caught a trace of something similar on a stranger. He told me, in return, about a brother he didn't have anymore, though he wouldn't say how, and something in the careful way he said it told me not to ask. Nothing dangerous happened that night. No one threatened anyone. For the first time since my father died, I let myself want something that had nothing to do with survival. Not the shop, not the lawsuit, not the coffee tin of cash slowly dwindling in my kitchen cabinet. Just a candlelit table and a man who listened like my answers mattered to him beyond whatever use he might make of them. Near the end of the evening, he said quietly that he didn't know how to do this without an agenda. Like honesty cost him something to admit, like the confession itself was a kind of risk he didn't often take. I told him then don't have one tonight, and neither of us looked away first. If you want to know whether he finally let his guard down completely, subscribe, because the next part is where the danger comes back, and it doesn't come back quietly. I found my shop torn apart 2 mornings later. Not robbed exactly, searched, fabric bolts pulled open and left in heaps across the floor like discarded skin, lining sliced clean through with a precision that made my stomach turn. Whoever had done it had known exactly where to cut to check for something hidden inside without wasting time on anywhere it wouldn't be. Drawers emptied with a kind of precision that told me whoever did this wasn't looking for cash, and they hadn't found it because the drawers were empty and the search kept going anyway, spreading into corners no thief interested in money would have bothered with. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before I could make myself step inside, my keys still in my hand, my heart going so fast I could feel it in my throat. The shop smelled wrong. Not smoke, not damage, just a faint trace of cologne that didn't belong to me or to any client I could immediately place, hanging in the air like a signature someone hadn't quite managed to erase. I called Adrian before I called anyone else. Not because my heart told me to, though it might have, but because he was the only person I knew with the resources to help me handle this without making it worse. Without the police, without Marsh's tired questions, circling back around to whatever it was he already suspected I was involved in. He didn't ask questions. He sent people within the hour. Quiet, efficient men who moved through my shop like they'd done this exact kind of work many times before, cataloging the damage, checking for anything the intruders might have left behind, sealing off the storefront window that someone had jimmied to get in. And for the first time, he told me plainly that this wasn't random, though he still wouldn't say why. He stayed with me that night, not out of performance, just presence, the kind of quiet company that asks nothing of you except that you're still breathing in the morning, sitting beside me on the floor of my ruined shop, saying very little, letting me lean into a silence that felt safer than any reassurance he could have offered instead. Under my workbench, one of his men found a torn scrap of lining fabric with the same double-stitch pattern I'd been finding for weeks, snagged on a splinter of wood where it must have caught as someone dragged a bolt of fabric across the floor in a hurry. I watched something shift behind Adrian's eyes when he saw it, something I hadn't seen from him before. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of grim confirmation, like a suspicion he'd been carrying had just been handed proof he didn't want. Whoever had searched my shop believed I still had something they needed. I just didn't know what yet. Hit like if you noticed that stitching pattern back when it first showed up, because it was about to matter more than either of us was ready for. 12. Adrian told me the truth in careful pieces, like he was afraid too much at once would break something in me. We sat in my half-repaired shop the next evening, the window boarded until a new pane could be fitted, a single lamp burning between us because I hadn't had the heart to fix the overhead lighting yet. For years, Holloway's funeral home had been a channel, a way to move messages, ledgers, instructions hidden inside garments prepared for exactly the kind of quiet jobs I'd been doing without ever asking why they paid so well. The dead, it turned out, made excellent couriers precisely because no one thought to search them twice, and no one thought to question a tailor called in to fix a crooked tie at 4 in the morning. The double stitching wasn't a flaw. It was a seal. Every panel I had ever repaired, I had actually finished, sending it wherever it was meant to go without ever knowing I'd done it. My hand's the last hands on a message before it traveled somewhere I'd never see, carried by a man who would never speak again to explain where he'd been going or why. I wasn't a bystander who had wandered into danger. I had been inside the machinery the entire time, working parts one never saw the shape of. Worse, Holloway hadn't started this with me. He'd started it with my father years earlier, which meant my father had known exactly what those panels were for and had never once told me. I thought of the photograph in the storage unit, my father standing beside a younger Holloway and a stranger I still couldn't place, and felt something in my chest fold in on itself. How long, I asked, did my father do this? Longer than I've been alive, Adrian said quietly. It's not something either of us chose walking into. It's something we were born standing inside of. Adrian explained that a man named Reyes, someone inside his own organization, had been trying to intercept and corrupt that channel, feeding false information through it as part of a much larger plan to take control from the inside. Instructions altered, ledgers rewritten, trust weaponized against the very people who'd built it. The break-in at my shop hadn't been random either. Reyes people had been looking for a message I had unknowingly finished and sent out days earlier, one that apparently hadn't reached its intended destination the way it was supposed to, one whose disappearance had made someone very nervous about what I might know, or might still have. I didn't cry. I felt something colder than that, a mix of violation and fury, at my father for his silence, at Holloway for the calm way he'd told me. I was imagining things I'd actually been living inside the entire time, at myself a little for not looking harder sooner. It seems I've been sewing for years without once asking why they were shaped the way they were. I looked at Adrian and asked him the only question that mattered. How long had he known who I really was in all of this? He didn't answer right away, and that hesitation told me more than any answer could have. This is the twist. Send this to whoever you've been talking about this story with, because I had just found out I was never simply standing outside the danger. I've been part of it all along. 13. The investigator came back within days, and this time he wasn't asking routine questions. Someone from Reyes' side had fed him just enough, anonymously, to make me sound like a knowing participant instead of an unwitting one. A tip, Marsh told me flatly, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table with a folder he didn't open, suggesting I'd been aware of exactly what I was sewing into those linings, that I'd been paid handsomely to look the other way. Obstruction, conspiracy, words that had never belonged anywhere near my life suddenly sat next to my name in official documents, in a folder Marsh wouldn't let me see, but described in enough detail to make my hands go cold. He told me, not unkindly, that things would go easier for me if I cooperated, if I told him everything I knew about Holloway's arrangement, about the man in charcoal who'd started showing up for fittings that had nothing to do with clothes. I told him nothing, not because I didn't want to help him, but because I genuinely didn't know what would help and what would bury me further, and because some instinct I trusted more than my own fear told me that whatever I said in that kitchen would find its way back to Reyes faster than it would find its way to justice. Adrian's lawyers could intervene, he told me later that day, but only by tying his name to mine publicly, which would put me directly in Reyes' path in a way I hadn't been before, a public connection, documented, undeniable, the kind of thing that couldn't be walked back once it existed. If we do this, Adrian said, There's no pretending afterward that you're not involved. Reyes will know exactly where to look for you. He already knows where to look for me. He's already torn my shop apart looking. This is different. This makes it official. Underneath the legal fear was something worse, a slower kind of anger, and it wasn't only aimed at Reyes or Marsh or the machinery I'd unknowingly been a part of for years. Adrian's hesitation had confirmed what I already suspected, that he'd known, even partially, that I might be tangled up in something bigger than tailoring, and he'd chosen not to tell me sooner. It wasn't a misunderstanding I could talk my way out of. It was a real question about whether he'd ever actually planned to give me the whole truth, or only the parts that were convenient once I'd already found a rest myself. You could have told me, I said, before any of this. Before my shop got torn apart, before Marsh started building a folder with my name on it. You could have told me what I was actually part of. I know. That's it. You know? I don't have a better answer than that, he said. And for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely uncertain, like a man who'd run out of the composed, unhurried confidence he usually wore so easily. I was trying to decide how much you could carry before it broke something. I got the calculation wrong. I know that now. I told him I needed distance, not because I'd stopped caring about him, but because I needed to know what I believed about all of this without his voice in the room while I figured it out. For the first time since this began, I chose to be completely alone with it, and I watched something close in his expression when I said it, some door quietly shutting on his end too, though he didn't argue, didn't try to talk me out of it. He simply nodded and left, and the shop felt very large and very empty once the door closed behind him. 14. Alone in my shop that night, I finally opened my father's old ledger, the one I'd always assumed was ordinary bookkeeping, kept on a high shelf in the back room, where it had sat gathering dust since before he died. A heavy leather-bound thing I'd moved a dozen times without ever once opening past the first few pages. It wasn't ordinary. The handwriting was his, unmistakably, the same slant he used on every pattern note he'd ever left me, but the entries weren't invoices. There was something else entirely, and my hand was shaking before I understood exactly what I was looking at. Don't miss what happens next, because what I found in my father's handwriting was about to change who actually held the power in this entire story. The ledger wasn't a record of sales. It was a coded history of every quiet job my father had ever completed, dates, initials, the same double-stitch notation I'd been finding for weeks, stretching back over a decade, long before Reyes had ever held the position he held now. Page after page of it, careful and precise, my father documenting in private what he'd never once spoken of aloud, as if some part of him had always known that someday the truth would need proof, and proof would need to survive him. I didn't call anyone right away. I sat with it for hours, the shop lamp burning low, cross-referencing it against my own notebook, the one I'd started weeks earlier without fully understanding why I needed it. Name against name, date against date, a pattern emerging slowly out of two sets of handwriting separated by years, but built from the exact same instinct. Write it down, keep it safe, trust the page more than you trust the people around you. By morning, I had something neither Adrian nor Holloway possessed, a corroborated timeline proving Reyes had been altering the contents of that channel for at least 18 months, feeding false information through work that people like my father and me had trusted enough to complete without question. Names appeared in my father's ledger that matched names Adrian had mentioned in passing, dates that lined up with disruptions I'd heard about only in fragments, and one entry, near the end, in my father's own hand, that read simply, R. Cannot be trusted with the northern route. Told H. Told no one else. I wasn't protecting myself anymore. I was building something. I contacted Adrian, not to reconcile, but on purely practical terms, calling his number and keeping my voice level even though my hands still weren't entirely steady. I told him plainly that I had leverage he needed, and at this time, I wasn't calling because I needed rescuing. I was calling because I'd found the one thing capable of ending this cleanly, and I intended to use it on my own terms. There was a long pause on the line before he answered. Where did you find it? My father's storage unit. He kept records the whole time. 18 months of exactly what Reyes has been doing in his own handwriting. That's not evidence. That's a weapon. Then I'd like to decide how it gets used, I said. Not you. Not Holloway. Me. Do you think I should have gone back to him for this or handled it entirely alone? Tell me before I tell you what happened next, because I was about to walk into a room full of people who had no idea what I was carrying. 15. The gala was held to honor the man I dressed that first cold morning, the one whose tie I'd retied at a stranger's insistence, and it drew exactly the kind of crowd I expected. Organization men in good suits, standing beside legitimate businessmen who had no idea what world they were actually standing inside. Chandeliers throwing warm light over a room built for exactly this kind of careful, dangerous performance of civility. Desmond Argyle was there too, which I hadn't expected, connected through business ties to people in Reyes' circle I hadn't known existed until that week. A connection Greer had discovered only days earlier, buried in filings that suddenly made a great deal more sense. I didn't attend as anyone's date. I wore a suit I'd made myself, sharp and unapologetic, the kind of thing I'd never had occasion to wear before, and I arranged my own evidence delivery in advance. A copy for my lawyer, a copy for a city official already in attendance. Every step planned so that whatever happened next would happen in the open, not in the dark, not dependent on anyone's goodwill, but my own preparation. Reyes tried to move first, presenting a manipulated version of the ledger to a small circle of listeners near the bar, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry, painting Adrian as reckless, unreliable, unfit to hold what he held. A performance clearly rehearsed, clearly timed for maximum damage in a room full of people whose opinions could shift the entire balance of power by morning. I stepped forward with my father's original pages, unaltered, undeniable, still smelling faintly of the storage unit dust. I hadn't fully cleaned off them, and they did more than clear Adrian's name. They proved my father's authorship of the Castellan name during the exact years Argyle claimed ownership, which meant the same evidence that saved one man in that room also saved my father's name in a courtroom that hadn't even convened yet. I read the relevant passages aloud, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, watching faces shift around the room as the pieces fell into place for people who had, until that moment, only ever heard Reyes' version of events. I watched Reyes lose the room in real time, watched his own allies quietly walk him out before anyone had to raise their voice, a slow, cold unraveling that happened almost entirely through silence. No one shouting, no one drawing a weapon, just a room full of powerful people quietly deciding, glass by glass, conversation by conversation, that they'd been backing the wrong man. Adrian turned to me in front of everyone, and instead of the question I expected, the one about what he could do for me, he asked what I needed from him now, like the direction of the question itself had changed permanently. No longer a man offering protection to someone he decided was worth protecting, but a man asking genuinely what I wanted, as if my answer actually mattered to how the rest of this went. If you love watching someone save herself first and then decide, on her own terms, whether to let someone else stand beside her, subscribe, because the ending isn't the one this genre usually gives you. 16. The lawsuit ended not with a dramatic reversal, but with paperwork. My father's ledger pages, standing as clean, direct proof that answered the exact legal question Argyle had built his case around. Greer filed the additional evidence within days, and Argyle's lawyers, faced with proof of both original authorship and a forfeited claim under the very clause Adrian had spotted weeks earlier, withdrew the suit before it ever reached a hearing. It wasn't fast. It wasn't cinematic. It was simply true, and true turned out to be enough. Inside the organization, Reyes disappeared from relevance quietly, the kind of ending that doesn't make headlines but changes everything anyway. No arrest, no dramatic confrontation, just a name that stopped being spoken in rooms where it used to carry weight, a man who found, one meeting at a time, that no one wanted to be seen standing too close to him anymore. Holloway lost more than his role. He lost the version of himself I'd trusted my entire adult life, and when Adrian and I confronted him together, there was no violence in the room, only the quiet, permanent loss of someone's respect, which turned out to be its own kind of consequence. He didn't defend himself much. He said only that he'd done what he thought my father would have wanted, protecting me from a truth he thought would break me rather than arm me. And I told him that wasn't his decision to make, and had never been his decision to make, and he didn't argue with that either. I didn't fold my shop into Adrian's world. I kept it mine, but I changed the sign above the door, repainting it myself late one night with steady hands, the brown packing paper long since torn down, so it read Castellan and Voss Bespoke, a partnership that mirrored what was happening between us without ever replacing what I'd built on my own. When Adrian asked me to marry him, it wasn't the thing that ended the danger. The danger was already over. It was simply the next honest thing, offered without an agenda this time, and accepted the same way. No candlelit performance required, just a quiet afternoon in the shop, both of us still smelling faintly of fresh paint. The last thing I did that season was stitch one final panel into the lining of his jacket, deliberately this time, a message meant only for him, sealed the same way I'd once sealed things without ever knowing what they meant. I didn't tell him what it said. Some things, I told him, were still worth sewing in, worth keeping close and quiet, and entirely mine to give rather than something taken or intercepted or misunderstood by anyone who wasn't meant to read it. If this ending hit you differently because I saved myself before anyone else got the chance to, share it with someone who needs to hear that a name can be rebuilt instead of just defended. And if you want the next story before anyone else does, subscribe now because I'm not done telling these yet.